My father used to say that a building is only as real as the paperwork that describes it. He meant it as a joke. He was a general contractor for 41 years, and he had a contractor's contempt for the regulatory apparatus that governed his trade. Permits, certificates, occupancy classifications, inspection sign-offs. He treated them as a tax on competence, a way for people who could not build to justify their paychecks by supervising people who could. When I told him, at 23, that I had accepted a position with the District Fire Compliance Office, he looked at me across the kitchen table for a long moment and then said, "Well, somebody has to do it." He did not mean it unkindly. He meant that he could not imagine why it would be me. I worked in fire compliance for 34 years. I reviewed certificates and renewals and inspection reports for buildings in 6 districts across 2 states. I audited sprinkler maintenance logs and alarm panel testing records and stairwell evacuation diagrams. I was, by the end, one of the more senior auditors in the region, and I had the specific and slightly boring reputation of being the person who caught things other people missed. Not because I was clever. I was not particularly clever. I was patient. I read documents slowly. I noticed when signatures on adjacent forms had been made with slightly different pens. I noticed when the file naming conventions on scanned inspection photographs did not match the archive standard for the year the inspection was supposed to have occurred. I noticed the small things, and the small things, in my line of work, were how the large things got caught. I want to tell you about a building on Merriweather Street. I will not tell you which city. I have made an accommodation with myself about that. The building is still there, and it is still being inspected, and I have decided that the specific address is not mine to disclose. If you know the city, you may already know the building. It is on a stretch of Merriweather that runs between a small park and the loading dock of a discount department store, and it sits between 2 other buildings that are both actively occupied, which is one of the things that makes it strange to look at, though most people who walk past it do not look at it. That is the first thing to understand. Most people never look at the building. It is unremarkable in the specific way that certain empty buildings are unremarkable. 6 stories of dark red brick, tall narrow windows with drawn blinds, a stone lintel over the front entrance carved with the year 1927 and the letters M.O.B., which I later learned stood for Merriweather Office Building, the name it was given by the developer who built it, and which no one has used since about 1963. There's a brass plate on the door that reads, "No soliciting." There's a mail slot in the door that is sealed with a metal plate on the inside. There is a doorbell that does not work. There is nothing to look at, and so people do not look. I first encountered the building not on Merriweather Street, but in a spreadsheet. The district was migrating its regulatory records from an old mainframe archive to a new cloud-based platform. This is a routine kind of project, tedious and expensive, and it produces the specific class of errors that make auditors necessary. Records get duplicated. Fields get truncated. Signatures scanned at insufficient resolution fail verification. Somebody in the office has to go through the exception reports and reconcile the discrepancies, and in the fall of the year I would like to call Year 0 for the purposes of this account. That somebody was me. The exception report I was working through that Tuesday morning contained 11,432 entries. Most of them were trivial. A property that had been reclassified in the interim between one inspection and the next. A contractor whose license number had changed after a business restructuring. A signature that had been scanned upside down. The kind of thing you dispatch in 90 seconds and move on from. Entry 4218 was different. The system had flagged it because the property's utility consumption records, imported from a separate database as part of the migration, showed the building had drawn no electricity, no water, and no gas for the past 27 consecutive years. The building's fire safety certificate, however, had been renewed annually throughout that period, most recently 4 months prior, with a valid signature and a current occupancy classification of B, general business use. I remember thinking, quite clearly, that this was going to be a 5-minute task. Occupancy classification B means the building is used for offices, and offices without electricity are not offices. The classification was obviously wrong. Somebody at some point in the last 27 years had failed to file the paperwork downgrading the building to vacant status, and the annual renewal had simply been rolling forward on autopilot ever since. This kind of thing happens more often than you would think. Buildings shift ownership. Records get orphaned. A single administrative oversight in 1996 can survive 3 decades of otherwise competent bookkeeping if no one has any reason to look at the file. I opened the file. The file was in order. That is the sentence I keep coming back to when I think about the beginning of this. The file was in order. Every annual certificate was present. Every inspection report was attached. Every renewal fee had been paid from a corporate account registered to a holding company whose name I did not recognize. Every inspection photograph had been uploaded on the correct date, with the correct file naming convention for the year in question. The most recent inspection, 4 months earlier, had been conducted by an inspector named Halloran, whom I knew personally. He had been in the office the previous week. He had complained about the parking situation. He was real. I called Halloran on the internal line. I asked him casually if he remembered inspecting the Merriweather office building. He said, "The what?" I gave him the address. He said, "I don't think I've ever been on that block." I said the file showed his signature on the inspection from June. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Send me the file. I'll take a look." I sent it. He called me back 40 minutes later. He said, "That's my signature. That's my inspector code. That's the correct photograph format for the current archive. But I did not do that inspection. I have no memory of doing it." I checked my calendar. On the date the file says, I was at Merriweather Street. I was at a suppression system recertification in Fairview. I have the mileage log. I said that was strange. He said, "It's more than strange. Look at the photographs." I looked at the photographs. The inspection package contained 23 photographs, in the standard format required by the district: a wide shot of the building exterior, a shot of the fire alarm control panel, a shot of the main sprinkler riser, a shot of each stairwell landing on each floor, a shot of each emergency exit sign, a shot of the elevator recall status display, and so on. Every photograph was properly framed, properly lit, properly labeled with the date and inspector code embedded in the metadata. Halloran said, "I've never been in that building." I said I understood. He said, "But those are inspection photographs I would have taken. I can tell by the framing. That's my framing." I said I would look into it. He said, "Do me a favor. Don't put my name on anything until you've figured out what this is." I said I would not. I hung up. I sat at my desk. I looked at the file for a long time. Then I did what I always did when something did not add up, which was to pull the previous year's file, and the year before that, and the year before that, and to read them all in order. The building had been inspected every year for 27 years. The inspections had been conducted by 14 different inspectors. Halloran had signed the most recent 3. Before him, an inspector named Youssef had signed 6. Before Youssef, an inspector named Cabrera had signed 4, and so on backward, through names I recognized and names I did not, until the sequence ended in 1997 with an inspector named Weiland, who had signed the very first certificate in the file, the one that had established the building's compliance history in the new digital system. I looked up Weiland in the personnel archive. Weiland had retired in 2003. He had died in 2011. The file contained certificates signed by Weiland in 2014, 2015, and 2016. I stared at those 3 certificates for a while. Then I pulled them individually, and I ran the digital signature audit, which is a standard tool that verifies the cryptographic hash of a signature against the inspector's registered credentials at the time of signing. The audit came back clean. Weiland's credentials had been valid on the dates of the signings. His inspector code had been active. His authorization to sign fire safety certificates had not been revoked. According to the system, Weiland had signed those certificates 3, 4, and 5 years after his death, using credentials that had not been deactivated because I checked. Nobody in the administrative office had ever filed the notification of his death with the Credentials Office. The Credentials Office had continued to renew Weiland's authorization annually on the automatic schedule because no one had ever told them not to. That, on its own, was explainable. It was a records hygiene failure. It happened. What was not explainable was that Weiland had, according to the file, actually used those credentials. Not just that the credentials existed, that they had been used to sign specific certificates on specific dates, with corresponding inspection photographs uploaded from a device registered to Weiland's name. The device had been assigned to him in 1998 and had never been returned. The device had continued to upload photographs to the district's inspection archive for 8 years after his death. I made a note. The note said, Weiland device location. Then I closed the file, and I went to lunch, and I told myself I would come back to it in the afternoon with a fresh head. I did not come back to it in the afternoon. My supervisor, a woman named Inez Kohler, stopped by my desk after lunch and asked me to prioritize a different batch of exceptions involving a chain of retail properties whose occupancy classifications had all been miscoded in the migration. That work took me the rest of the week. When I returned to the Merriweather file the following Monday, I found that the exception flag had been cleared. Somebody, over the weekend, had reviewed my initial note on the file and had marked the discrepancy as resolved records hygiene issue. No further action required. The reviewer's name was listed as I. Kohler. I asked Inez about it at the coffee machine. I said I had been working on a strange file the week before, and I had noticed she had cleared it over the weekend. She said she had cleared a lot of exceptions over the weekend. She had been trying to get the migration project back on schedule. I asked her if she remembered the Merriweather Street file specifically. She thought about it. She said, "The one with the utility consumption issue?" I said yes. She said, "Records hygiene. We see it all the time. Somebody missed a reclassification back in the 90s, and it's been rolling forward ever since." I flagged the file for archive review and reset the exception. It's not our problem to fix. That's a property records issue, not a fire compliance issue. I said the file also had a signature problem. I mentioned Weiland. She looked at me. She had a particular way of looking at me when I had said something she wished I had not said. It was not a hostile look. It was closer to disappointment. She said, "Weiland retired a long time ago." I said Weiland had died in 2011. She said, "That happens." I said his signature was on certificates from 2014, 2015, and 2016. She said, "The digital signature system had problems for a while in that period. There were a lot of credential rollover issues. It's been fixed." I said the certificates had passed the digital signature audit. She said, "Then the audit is doing its job. Look, I appreciate the diligence, but you have a queue of 11,000 other exceptions to clear. Please don't get stuck on one file. If there's a systemic issue with credential rollover from that period, the credentials office will find it in their own audit. It's not our department." I said I understood. She said, "Also, don't run any more digital signature audits on files that have already been resolved. It generates workflow tickets in 3 other departments, and they have to write reports about why the ticket was generated. It's a lot of paperwork for something that isn't our problem." I said I would not. She smiled and touched my elbow briefly, in a way she sometimes did when she was trying to signal that she liked me, but was also giving me a professional instruction that she expected me to follow. Then she went back to her office. I want to say clearly that at this point I had no intention of continuing the investigation. I did not think there was anything to investigate. I thought there was a records hygiene issue on a vacant building, and I thought Weiland's credentials had probably been used by another inspector who had failed to update the credential fields after Weiland's retirement, which is a thing that happens, and which produces exactly the sort of forensically valid but factually impossible signatures I had been looking at. I had been an auditor long enough to know that most anomalies have unglamorous explanations. What changed my mind was a small thing. It was the following Tuesday, at about 4 in the afternoon. I was working through a different batch of exceptions, and I happened to have the district's inspection scheduling calendar open in another window. The scheduling calendar showed all upcoming inspections, sorted by district, with the assigned inspector's name and the property address. It was a routine tool. I used it dozens of times a week. I noticed, in passing, a scheduled inspection for the Merriweather office building. The inspection was scheduled for the 15th of the following June. The assigned inspector was Halloran. The following June was 8 months away. The scheduling calendar did not normally show inspections that far in advance. It typically showed a rolling 90-day window. I checked. 90 days was the setting. But the Merriweather inspection was there, at 8 months out, with Halloran's name attached. I filtered the calendar to show only inspections for the Merriweather office building. The calendar returned 12 entries, extending forward in 1-year increments, all with inspection dates in mid-June, all with assigned inspectors. The inspectors for the first 3 upcoming inspections were Halloran, Halloran, and Halloran. The inspector for the 4th upcoming inspection, 4 years out, was someone named T. Ostro. I did not know an inspector named T. Ostro. I checked the personnel archive. There was no active or retired inspector by that name. I made another note. The note said, T. Ostro who? I closed the calendar. I went home. I did not sleep well. The next morning I did something I had not done in a long time. I went to the physical archive. The district maintained a physical archive on the 4th floor of the administrative building, which contained records that predated the digitization initiative of the mid-1990s. Most of the material in the physical archive had been scanned and imported into the digital system during the initial digitization, and again during the current migration. But the physical originals were retained under the state's Records Retention Statute. The archive was staffed part-time by a clerk named Ms. Devai, who was in her 70s and who had, as far as anyone in the office could tell, been born in the archive. I asked Ms. Devai if she could pull me the original inspection file for a property at Merriweather Street. I gave her the address. She looked at me over her reading glasses for a moment, and then she typed the address into her terminal. She looked at the screen for a longer moment than the query should have taken. Then she said, "Which years?" I said, "All of them." She said, "That will take a while." I said I had time. She said, "It will take longer than you have this morning. Come back after lunch." I came back after lunch. On her desk was a single manila folder, thin, with the property address handwritten on the tab in a careful, old-fashioned script. I asked her where the rest of the files were. She said, "That's the file." I said the building had 30 years of inspection history in the digital system. There should be at least 30 folders. She said, "That's the file we have." I opened the folder. It contained 3 documents. The first was a property registration from 1927, filed when the building was completed. The second was a change of use notification from 1963, downgrading the building from Class A office space to Class B general business space. The third was a memorandum, dated 1994, on letterhead I did not recognize. The letterhead read, "Office of Structural Continuity, District Administrative Annexes." The memorandum was addressed to the District Fire Compliance Office. It was 1 paragraph long. It read, "Please be advised that the property located at address redacted in this account has been designated a legacy structure under the Continuity Certification Framework. All routine inspection, certification, and renewal activities for this property will proceed on the standard annual schedule. Inspector assignments will be coordinated through our office. Please direct all correspondence regarding this property to the undersigned. Standard filing procedures apply. Thank you for your cooperation." It was signed by someone named A. Varick, Director. There was no contact information beyond the letterhead. I asked Ms. Devai if she knew what the Office of Structural Continuity was. She said, "No." I said the memorandum was on district letterhead. She said, "I can see that." I asked her if she had ever seen a memorandum from that office before. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've been asked not to answer questions about that office." I asked her who had asked her. She said, "I've been asked not to answer questions about that either." I said I understood. She said, "I don't think you do, but I appreciate that you're trying to be polite about it." I asked her if I could photograph the memorandum. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "The photocopier is behind you. It's 5 cents a page. Please leave the money in the tin." I photocopied the memorandum. I left a dime in the tin. I thanked her. I left. That evening at home, I looked up the Office of Structural Continuity. There was no such office in any public directory. There was no such office in the district's internal directory, which I could access from home through a secure portal. There was no reference to continuity certification in any code manual, statute, regulation, or internal procedure document that I could locate. The framework did not appear to exist. The office did not appear to exist. And yet the memorandum, dated 1994, on letterhead that matched the district's typographic standards of the period, sat on my kitchen table, and it referenced both. I want to describe what happened over the next several months as economically as possible, because if I described everything I did, we would be here for a great deal longer than either of us has time for. What I did was that I looked. I looked in every archive I had access to. I looked in the digital records, and I looked in the physical archive. I looked in the credentialing office's shared drive, which I had access to as a senior auditor. I looked in the property records office, which was a separate agency, and to which I did not, strictly, have official access, but which was staffed by a woman named Priyanka, who owed me a favor from an earlier project and who allowed me to review certain files on a monitor in her office during her lunch break. What I found, over those months, formed a picture. The picture was not complete. I want to be careful about that. What I am about to describe is the picture I was able to assemble from the fragments I could access, and I have no doubt that there is a larger picture I could not see. But the fragments were internally consistent, and they were sufficient to convince me that what I was looking at was not a records hygiene issue. The building at Merriweather Street had been designated a legacy structure in 1994. I could find no record of what had happened at the building prior to 1994 that would have justified the designation. The building had operated as ordinary commercial office space from 1927 to some point in the late 1980s, at which point its tenants had, over a period of about 18 months, all vacated. The final tenant, a firm of patent attorneys, had left in 1989. The building had then been listed for lease for approximately 4 years, without success, and had gone into administrative dormancy. In 1994, someone had designated it a legacy structure, and its inspection history had continued from that point forward, as though it were still fully occupied. The Office of Structural Continuity, which I had never heard of before opening Ms. Devai's folder, existed. I established this to my own satisfaction over about 6 weeks of careful triangulation. It had a listed budget in the district's Consolidated Appropriations Statement, buried under a line item labeled Administrative Continuity Legacy Assets. The line item was small, about $300,000 a year, and it had appeared in every Consolidated Appropriations Statement I could locate going back to 1994. The office had a personnel roster, though I could not access it directly. I inferred its existence from an HR benefits allocation report that identified 12 full-time positions attached to a department code I could not match to any office in the public directory. The office had a physical location. This I established indirectly by noticing that the district's building services department sent monthly cleaning invoices to an office suite in the administrative annex, whose room number did not appear on any of the annex's public floor plans. I did not attempt to visit the office. I want to be clear about that. I had, by this point, developed a strong intuition that the Office of Structural Continuity did not want to be visited, and I had also developed a strong intuition that my professional life would proceed more smoothly if I respected that preference. But I noted the room number, and I noted the days on which the cleaning crew visited, and I noted in passing that the cleaning invoices specified that the cleaning was to occur only between the hours of 10 and 11 in the morning, and only on Tuesdays, and only when accompanied by a member of the office's staff who would unlock the suite in advance and lock it afterward. The legacy structure framework, meanwhile, appeared to encompass more than one building. I could not determine the full list, but I identified, through the appropriations, statements and the cleaning invoices and the inspection scheduling calendar, and various other secondary sources, at least 7 other properties in the district that were being maintained under the same framework. All of them were commercial buildings. All of them had, as far as I could determine, been vacant for at least 2 decades. All of them received annual fire safety certifications. Several of them, I would later confirm, also received annual elevator certifications, annual boiler inspections, and annual structural engineering reviews, despite having no active tenants, no active utility service, and, in at least 2 cases, no functional elevators or boilers. The inspectors who signed the certificates for these buildings were real. I confirmed this for the ones whose names I recognized. Halloran was real. Youssef was real. Cabrera was real. Weiland had been real before he died, but the inspections they had signed for, in almost every case I was able to verify, had not been conducted by them. Halloran told me flatly that he had never been inside the Merriweather building. Youssef, when I reached him by phone at the retirement community where he had moved after leaving the district, told me the same thing about the Merriweather building and about 2 of the other buildings I asked him about. He said he remembered signing certificates for those buildings. He remembered receiving the paperwork in his mail slot, along with the inspection photographs and the completed forms, and he remembered signing them because they were properly prepared, and because signing them was part of his job. He had not, he said, ever asked where the completed forms came from. He assumed some other inspector had done the field work and passed the paperwork to him for administrative sign-off. That happened sometimes. It was not strictly permitted, but it happened. I asked Youssef who he thought had done the field work. He said, "I never thought about it." I said he must have thought about it a little. He said, "You would think so." But I really didn't. I asked him if he had ever received paperwork from an Office of Structural Continuity. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I don't remember that name." I said I thought he might. He said, "I don't remember that name." I said, "All right." He said, "Please don't call this number again." He hung up. I put down the phone. I sat in my kitchen. I want to describe accurately how I felt at that moment, because the feeling was one I had not experienced before and have not experienced since. It was not fear. It was more like the specific vertigo one feels when one realizes that a story one has been told all one's life is a lie. Not a small lie, a structural lie. The kind of lie that requires many other people to have been complicit for many years, in ways that they perhaps did not fully understand themselves. Youssef was a decent man. I had worked with him for a decade. He had signed hundreds of certificates for buildings he had never entered, and he had not asked where the paperwork came from, because the paperwork had always been correct, and because asking would have been a kind of trouble that his life did not require. I could not blame him. I understood him. I had, for most of my career, been him. The distinction I had made, in that moment, was that I was no longer him. I had asked. I could not unask. I went to the building. I did this on a Saturday morning in the early spring. I did not tell anyone. I drove into the city and I parked 3 blocks away, and I walked to Merriweather Street with a clipboard and my inspector's badge, which I was still authorized to carry, and I stood on the sidewalk across the street from the Merriweather office building for about 10 minutes before I crossed over. The building was exactly as I have described it, 6 stories of dark red brick. Tall, narrow windows with drawn blinds. A stone lintel over the front entrance carved with the year 1927 and the letters M.O.B. A brass plate on the door that read, "No soliciting." I climbed the 3 shallow steps to the entrance. The door was heavy wood, painted black, with a small window at eye level covered from the inside by a metal grate. I tried the handle. The door was unlocked. I stood there for a moment with the handle in my hand. I had expected the door to be locked. I had a set of standard inspector's tools in my bag, including a set of override keys for common commercial locks, but I had not seriously expected to use including a set of override keys for common commercial locks, but I had not seriously expected to use them. I had expected to find the building sealed and to be able to record that fact in my notes and to leave. The door being unlocked changed the nature of what I was doing. I want to say that I hesitated. I did hesitate. But I also, standing there, understood that if I did not go in, I would go home, and I would sit with the question of what was inside for the rest of my life, and I would eventually come back, and the next time I would go in, and it would be worse for having waited. So I went in. The lobby was clean. That is the sentence I have found hardest to say to anyone over the years, because it does not sound frightening. But it was the thing that frightened me most about the building, and it frightens me still. Because it should not have been. The lobby of a building that has been unoccupied for 27 years should be a specific kind of ruin. There should be a smell. There should be a film of dust on every surface, thick enough to leave footprints in. There should be dead insects on the windowsills, water damage on the ceiling tiles, patches where the wallpaper has separated from the plaster. There should be evidence of intrusion graffiti, broken glass, the residue of people who had come in over the years to do the things people do in empty buildings. There was none of that. The lobby was clean. The tile floor had been mopped, recently enough that I could smell a faint chemical residue in the air, the way you can smell it in a hotel lobby after the overnight cleaning. The reception desk, along the left-hand wall, had been dusted. There was a wooden umbrella stand next to the desk with no umbrellas in it. There was a directory board mounted on the wall opposite the entrance, listing the building's tenants. I walked over to it. The directory board listed 12 tenants across 6 floors. I recognized none of the company names. The letters slotted into the board were the small white plastic kind that you push into a grooved black felt backing. They were correctly aligned. None of them were missing. Above the directory board, mounted in a metal frame, was the building's fire safety certificate. It was the current year's certificate. It was signed by Halloran. Below it, in a smaller frame, was the building's occupancy classification card. It read, Occupancy Class B Maximum, Occupancy 340. I stood in the lobby for perhaps 2 minutes. I did not hear anything. I did not see anyone. But I had the distinct impression, standing there, that the building was not empty. Not in the sense that there was someone in it with me. I do not believe there was someone in it with me, but in the sense that the building was in use. It was being used for something. The lobby had been prepared the way a lobby is prepared before the workday begins. Somebody had mopped it. Somebody had dusted the reception desk. Somebody had made sure the directory was current, and the certificate was displayed. I walked to the elevator. There were 2 elevators in the lobby, side by side, with brushed metal doors. I pressed the call button on the leftmost elevator. The button lit up. I heard the mechanical hum of the elevator descending from an upper floor. This should not have been possible. The building had no active utility service. I checked my phone. I still had signal. I was still in the world I understood. The elevator arrived at the ground floor. The doors opened. The elevator was empty. The interior was lit. The floor of the elevator was clean. There was a small brass plaque next to the floor buttons that read, "Inspected, Certified, Current Year." I did not get into the elevator. I stepped back from it. The doors closed after the standard 6-second delay. I heard the elevator ascending. I watched the floor indicator above the door. 1, 2, 3, 4. It stopped at 4. It stayed at 4. I turned around. I walked out of the lobby. I closed the door behind me. I walked back down the 3 shallow steps to the sidewalk, and I walked the 3 blocks to my car, and I drove home, and I did not tell anyone what I had seen for a long time. I want to describe now what happened over the following months because it is the part of the story that matters most, and it is the part I have thought about most. Nothing happened is the first thing I want to say. No one came to my house. I received no threatening phone calls. No one from the Office of Structural Continuity appeared in my office to warn me off. I was not followed, as far as I could tell, and I was not visited by mysterious officials, and I was not offered a transfer to a distant regional office. The intimidation when it came was subtler than that. It was the intimidation of nothing happening. I filed a formal exception report on the Merriweather file through the proper internal channels. I noted the utility discrepancy. I noted the signature anomalies. I noted the existence of the 1994 memorandum from the Office of Structural Continuity. I attached the photocopy. I recommended that the file be reviewed by the district's Office of Internal Audit, which was the appropriate escalation for exceptions of this class. The report was acknowledged within 48 hours by the Office of Internal Audit, which assigned it a case number and informed me that it would be reviewed in due course. That was the last I heard about it. I checked the case status every week for 6 months. It remained under review. I checked it after a year. Still under review. I checked it after 2 years. Still under review. I filed a second exception report on one of the other legacy structures I had identified. Same acknowledgement, same case number format. Same eternal review status. I filed a third, same. I stopped filing them. I want to be honest about my emotional state during this period. I was not obsessed, in the dramatic sense. I did not stop functioning. I continued to do my job. I continued to see my family. I continued to read novels in the evenings and to go for walks on the weekends. But I had a low-grade preoccupation that would not leave me, and it grew, over the months, into something heavier. I would be doing something ordinary, buying groceries, standing in line at the pharmacy, and I would find myself thinking about the elevator that had ascended to the 4th floor when there was no one in it and no one to call it there. I would think about the mopped lobby. I would think about the directory board with the 12 tenant names on it, and I would wonder whether the tenants existed and whether they had employees and whether the employees came to work. I began, in a small way, to visit the building. Not often, perhaps once every 2 or 3 months. I would drive past it on weekends and look at it from the street. I never went back inside. I told myself, each time, that I was making an observation. I was noting whether anything had changed. Nothing ever changed. The blinds were always drawn. The door was always closed. The brass plate always read, "No soliciting." Once in the winter, I noticed that the sidewalk in front of the building had been shoveled after a snowstorm, and the sidewalks of the buildings on either side had not. I stood on the far side of the street looking at that clean strip of concrete for a long time. I began, also, to compile a private file. I did not photograph documents at work. I had learned from earlier experiences that photographing documents at work generates suspicion. Instead, I took handwritten notes on a legal pad at my desk, and I transcribed them into a personal notebook at home, and I built up over about 18 months. Work generates suspicion. Instead, I took handwritten notes on a legal pad at my desk, and I transcribed them into a personal notebook at home, and I built up, over about 18 months, a substantial private archive of everything I had learned about the legacy structure framework, and the Office of Structural Continuity, and the buildings I had come to think of as its wards. I kept the notebook in a locked drawer in my study. I did not show it to my wife. I did not show it to my colleagues. I did not know what I was going to do with it. I still do not know. The visit came in the 20th month. I had begun to think by then that no visit was going to come. This was, I now realize, the point of the delay. If they had come to me in the first month, I would have understood what was happening. I would have understood that I had crossed a line. By the 20th month, I had begun to relax. I had begun to think that perhaps the Office of Structural Continuity did not care about auditors who noticed. Perhaps they had absorbed my exception reports into their review queue and forgotten about me. Perhaps I was safe. This is what made the visit, when it came, so effective. I had let my guard down. That was, I believe, the intention. The visitor was a woman. She came to my office on a Thursday afternoon, in late autumn. She was in her 60s. She wore a charcoal wool coat and carried a leather satchel. She did not have an appointment. She introduced herself as Ms. Varick. I recognized the name from the 1994 memorandum. I felt, hearing it, a small physical sensation in my chest, like a door closing. She sat down in the chair across from my desk without being invited. She did not remove her coat. She placed the satchel on the floor beside her chair and folded her hands in her lap and looked at me with an expression of great patience. She said, "I understand you've been interested in some of our properties." I said I had noticed some anomalies in the compliance records. She said, "Yes, you've been thorough. Halloran said you would be." I said Halloran had told her about our conversation. She said, "Halloran works for us." I said Halloran worked for the Fire Compliance Office. She said, "Halloran works for both offices. Most of the senior inspectors do, eventually. It's part of the career track. You would have been offered a position with us in about 3 years if you had not begun looking on your own. You have, unfortunately, disqualified yourself from that offer. But the disqualification is administrative, not personal. We hold no grudge." I did not know what to say to that. I said the first thing that came into my head, which was to ask her what the Office of Structural Continuity actually did. She considered the question. Then she said, "We maintain the compliance of certain buildings that cannot be permitted to lapse." I asked her why they could not be permitted to lapse. She said because a building that lapses out of the regulatory system stops existing, in a particular sense. It stops being a legal entity. Its address becomes available for reassignment. Its property record can be closed. Its physical structure can be demolished without further review. For most buildings, this is fine. For certain buildings, it is not fine. Certain buildings need to remain in the system. They need to have current certificates. They need to have scheduled inspections. They need to have occupancy classifications. They need to have, for lack of a better term, an administrative pulse. If they do not, things happen that we would prefer did not happen. I asked her what things. She smiled, very slightly. She said, "I'm not going to tell you that. I will tell you that in the 71 years the office 71 years the Office of Structural Continuity has existed, we have allowed exactly 3 buildings to lapse out of the system, in each case because a political administration insisted on it against our recommendation. In all 3 cases, the outcome was one we do not care to repeat. Since the last such incident, in 1978, we have been given a fairly free hand. That is why the office is small and quiet, and why very few people in the district administration know that we exist. It is easier for everyone that way. I asked her if the buildings were dangerous. She said, "No, the buildings themselves are not dangerous. The buildings, when properly maintained within the compliance framework, are entirely inert. They fairly free hand. That is why the office is small and quiet, and why very few people in the district administration know that we exist. It is easier for everyone that way." I asked her if the buildings were dangerous. She said, "No, the buildings themselves are not dangerous. The buildings, when properly maintained within the compliance framework, are entirely inert. They sit. They pass their inspections. They do not require anything from anyone except the routine renewal of their paperwork. It is an extremely economical arrangement. It costs the district a few $100,000 a year to keep them all in good administrative standing. The alternative, in the cases where the alternative has been tried, has cost considerably more in ways that are difficult to describe in a budget line." I asked her what happened inside the buildings. She said, "Nothing happens inside the buildings. I have been in every one of them. They are empty. They are clean. They are inspected. That is all." What you saw when you went into the Merriweather building, the mopped lobby, the maintained directory, the functioning elevator, is not the building being used. It is the building being maintained in the state that the paperwork describes. The paperwork says the building is a Class B office structure with 12 tenants and a maximum occupancy of 340. So we keep it in the physical condition of a Class B office structure with 12 tenants and a maximum occupancy of 340. It is like a museum, if you like. A museum of a building that is otherwise not there. I said I did not fully understand. She said, "I know. You are not going to. I have worked in this office for 34 years, and I do not fully understand. I have colleagues who have spent their whole careers on the theoretical side, and they do not fully understand either. What we understand is the procedure. The procedure works. When we follow it, nothing happens. When we do not follow it, things happen. That is the entire operational knowledge of the office. Anything beyond that is speculation, and speculation is discouraged." I asked her about the inspectors, about Weiland, about the signatures after his death. She said, "Weiland was one of ours. When one of ours dies, we sometimes continue to use their credentials for a period of years, particularly if their signature is stylistically distinctive and cross-referenced across many files. It reduces the appearance of discontinuity in the compliance record. The digital signature system permits it, because the credentials remain valid until they are formally revoked, and we do not formally revoke them. It is technically a violation of several policies, It is also technically essential to the continuity of certain files. These are the accommodations one makes. I asked her about T. Ostro, the future inspector I did not recognize. She said, Ostro will be hired in about 3 years. She is currently completing her engineering degree. We identify candidates early. We enter their names into the scheduling system as soon as their assignment to a particular property is confirmed by our planning committee. It is a small efficiency. It also allows us to detect exactly the kind of curiosity that brought you here. If you had not noticed Ostro's name on the scheduling calendar, this conversation might have taken a different form. I said I did not understand what she meant. She said, I mean that this conversation is, in its way, a courtesy. We are having it because you noticed Ostro's name, which means you have the attention to detail we require in candidates, and because you filed your exception reports through the proper channels rather than going to the press or to elected officials, which means you have the institutional discretion we require. If either of those things had not been true, we would not be having this conversation. We would be having a different one, or none. I asked her what she wanted from me. She said, I want you to stop. I want you to complete your current audit rotation, take your accrued leave, and submit your retirement paperwork. You are within 18 months of eligibility. We will facilitate an early retirement with full benefits. You will keep your pension. You will keep your health coverage. You will keep the good opinion of your colleagues, none of whom will know that anything unusual has occurred. You will not discuss the legacy structure framework with anyone. You will not visit any of the properties again. If you comply, you will have a quiet and comfortable retirement. If you do not, we will proceed to other options. I would prefer not to describe them. I asked her if I could keep the notebook. She looked at me. She looked at me for what felt like a long time. Then she said, Yes, keep the notebook. Show it to no one. When you die, it will be collected. That is a term of the arrangement. Please make sure your will directs the executor to preserve your papers rather than destroy them. And please leave the executor's contact information with our office. I will provide you with a card. She reached into her satchel and produced a small white card and set it on my desk. It contained a phone number. No name, no address, no agency. She said, You may call this number if you have questions. Please do not call it for any other reason. She stood. She smoothed her coat. She said, For what it is worth, I think you would have been very good at this work. I am sorry we did not reach you sooner. She left. I retired 11 months later. I did not use up my accrued leave, because I did not want to spend that time not working. I wanted to work through it. I completed my current audit rotation. I trained my replacement, a young man named Escobar, whom I liked and whom I did not tell anything. I submitted my retirement paperwork on the first day of the month I became eligible. I received a farewell cake in the break room. Inez Kohler gave a short speech in which she said kind things about my thoroughness. Halloran was in the room. He shook my hand at the end of the party and said, Enjoy the rest. He held my hand for a beat longer than was ordinary. I did not read anything into it. I did not need to. I have been retired for 11 years at the time I am writing this. For the first several years, I did not check the compliance registry. I had promised myself that I would not. I kept the promise. I read novels. I traveled with my wife. I helped my daughter through a difficult period in her marriage. I have been retired for 11 years at the time I am writing this. For the first several years, I did not check the compliance registry. I had promised myself that I would not. I kept the promise. I read novels. I traveled with my wife. I helped my daughter through a difficult period in her marriage. I attended the funerals of several colleagues, including Youssef, who had a long and comfortable retirement in the community I had reached him at, and who died in his sleep at 81. I did not attend Wyland's grave, though I knew where it was. Some accommodations one makes. In the 5th year of my retirement, I checked the registry once. This is what I want to describe, and then I will stop. The compliance registry is a public system. Anyone can access it. You go to the district's website and you enter an address, and you can see the property's current occupancy classification and the date of its most recent fire safety certification, and the name of the inspector who signed it. It is a routine tool used mostly by real estate agents and building buyers and prospective tenants. It is not restricted in any way. I entered the Merriweather address. The property was listed as vacant. This surprised me. In all the time I had spent looking at the file, the occupancy classification had remained Class B, active. Now it was vacant. I felt, seeing that, a brief and complicated relief, as though something had been resolved. Then I looked at the fire safety certificate. It was current. It had been renewed 4 months earlier. It had been signed by an inspector named G. Escobar. Escobar, the young man I had trained, my replacement, who had, I knew from a mutual acquaintance, retired the previous year at 57, unusually early, with what he had told colleagues was a health issue, but which no one had ever seen him actually suffer from. He had moved out of state. He had not stayed in touch. The signature was Escobar's. I knew his signature. I had watched him sign hundreds of forms during his training. This one was current. It bore his current inspector code, which should not have been active because he had retired. I closed the browser. I sat in my study for a while. Then I went into the kitchen and made myself a cup of tea, and I brought it back to the study, and I drank it slowly, and I thought about a great many things. I checked the registry once a year since then. I check it on the anniversary of the day I first opened the file, which is a small superstition I have allowed myself. Each year, the building is listed as vacant. Each year, the fire safety certificate is current. Each year, the certificate is signed by Escobar. He is now, according to the registry, 73 years old, and I have reason to believe he died last winter. I have not been able to confirm this. Our mutual acquaintance has stopped returning my calls. It is possible she has been asked to stop. It is possible she has simply moved on. I do not know. I want to end with something my father said, though he would not remember saying it, because he said it as a joke and he did not know I would remember. It was late in his life, and we were sitting on the porch of the house he had built himself, in the town where I grew up, and we were talking about a building he had put up in the 60s that had been demolished the previous year to make room for a shopping plaza. He was not sentimental about it. He said the building had done its job, and it was time for it to come down. Then he laughed and said, "A building is only as real as the paperwork that describes it. When the paperwork stops, the building stops. That's the arrangement. That's the deal." He said it as a joke. I want to be clear about that. He did not know what he was saying. He was a general contractor, and he had a contractor's contempt for the regulatory apparatus, and he was making a small, tired joke about the way permits and certificates and inspections seemed sometimes to matter more than the physical structures they described. I did not laugh at the time. I remember thinking he had said something more true than he intended. I still think that. There is a building on Merriweather Street. It is 6 stories of dark red brick. It has been vacant for 38 years, according to the property records. Its fire safety certificate is current. Its inspection photographs upload on schedule. Its lobby, if you were to walk into it on a Saturday morning, would be mopped, and its directory would list 12 tenants, and its elevator would arrive when called, and it would ascend to the 4th floor when no one had asked it to. Mopped, and its directory would list 12 tenants, and its elevator would arrive when called, and it would ascend to the 4th floor when no one had asked it to. The certificate on the wall is signed by a man who I believe is dead. In 3 years, the certificate will be signed by someone else. In 30 years, it will be signed by someone whose name is already in the scheduling system, waiting. The building is not the only one. There are 7 others in my district, at least, and I have come to suspect, from certain patterns in the appropriations statements I still occasionally review, that there are similar buildings in every district in the state, and probably in every state. I do not know how many there are. I do not know what would happen if the paperwork stopped. I know only that the paperwork does not stop, and that the buildings remain, and that they are inspected every year by inspectors who do not remember inspecting them, and that this arrangement has been in place in one form or another for longer than I have been alive. I have kept the card Ms. Varick left on my desk. It is in the drawer with the notebook. I have never called the number. I sometimes take it out and look at it, and I sometimes think about calling, because there are questions I would still like to ask, and because I am getting older, and because I would like, before I am done, to understand a little more of what I spent my career adjacent to without knowing. But then I put the card back in the drawer, and I close the drawer, and I go back to whatever I was doing, because I understand now that the arrangement Miss Varick described is not one in which understanding is on offer. It is one in which compliance is on offer, and compliance is what has been kept, and compliance is what will continue to be kept, by people whose job it is to keep it, in an office whose name does not appear on any door, in a building whose room number does not appear on any floor plan, for reasons that no one in the office fully understands and that no one has ever been permitted to write down. The building on Merriweather Street will be inspected again next June. The inspector's name is already in the system. I will not be alive to see who signs the certificate after that one. Somebody will. The paperwork will continue. The building will continue. That is the arrangement. That is the deal.